The lights went out behind his eyes.
Yes.
Not darkness. White. A violent total white that swallowed the auction room whole. Choi Hyun-woo had been standing at the head of the negotiating table, one hand resting on the edge, the other gesturing toward the terracotta figure at the room's center. A knockhead,
Knockhead is
2,000 years old, serene-faced and stolen. Currently the subject of a bidding war between three men who had no business owning it. He had been mid-sentence. He had been completely in control. Then the white came and his legs simply stopped working. He didn't convulse. He didn't cry out. He went down the way ancient things collapse. Silently, suddenly, as if the weight of something long carried had finally become too much. The glass in his hand hit the floor half a second after he did. Nobody moved. 7 people in the room and not one of them moved. Because men who traffic in priceless objects do not rush toward chaos. They wait to see which way it falls. The only person who moved was the woman across the room. She had been brought in to authenticate the knockhead. She was standing near the window with her loupe and her notes and her quiet professional detachment, and she crossed the room in 6 steps and was on her knees beside him before his assistant even finished saying his name. She turned him carefully, checked his airway, pulled a small torch from the inner pocket of her blazer. Who carries a torch in their blazer? And opened his eyes one at a time. What she saw made her go very still. Has he complained about his vision? She said to the room, to no one, to everyone. Headaches. One eye, usually the left. Balance problems, ringing in the ears, yes or no? His personal assistant, Tae-young, found his voice first. He said it was migraines. For months he's been saying migraines. The woman closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and said, "Call an ambulance. Now." And nobody touched that terracotta. We have a much larger problem than who owns that piece. Her name, Hyun-woo would learn later, was Sochi Ola, and she had been waiting 3 years to find him. If you're already wondering how a conservator knew what was wrong with him before the doctors did, and why she said they had a larger problem than the stolen artifact, stay with me and subscribe to this channel right now, because this story goes places you will not see coming. The private clinic in Victoria Island had seen everything. Politicians with gunshot wounds admitted as road traffic accidents. Businessmen detoxing from things that didn't appear in newspapers. Wives with injuries that matched no fall anyone believed. Choi Hyun-woo arrived by ambulance and was triaged in under 4 minutes. Sochi Ola arrived 30 seconds behind the ambulance in a taxi, still holding her authentication notes, and told the receiving nurse that the patient had presented with sudden onset vision loss and lower body collapse, likely neurological, possibly toxic, and that she needed to speak to the attending physician before any medication was administered. The nurse looked at her the way Nigerian nurses look at people who walk into emergency rooms issuing instructions. Sochi looked back the way women who have spent a decade working in rooms where nobody listened to them have learned to look. They let her speak to the doctor. Hyun-woo was stable by the time she was done speaking. His vision was returning. Slowly, grayly, the white retreating to the edges. He could hear the machines. He could feel the IV in his arm. He turned his head and found Sochi Ola sitting in the plastic chair beside his bed with her notes still in her lap, looking at him the way you look at something you have been trying to protect from a distance for a very long time and have finally reached. "You're awake," she said. "What's wrong with me?" She was quiet for a moment. "The doctors are running a full panel. Heavy. Metals, neurological markers. It will take a few hours." She paused. "But I already know what they'll find." "Then tell me." "Not yet. I need you to be stronger before I tell you." "I'm strong enough now." She paused for a while and looked at him steadily. You've been poisoned, slowly, over a long period, months, maybe longer, small doses, something that mimics neurological deterioration. If you'd gone another few weeks without intervention, the vision loss would have become permanent. After that, she stopped. After that, he said, after that there would have been nothing left to intervene for. The room was very quiet. Outside, Lagos carried on, generators humming, traffic howling, the city indifferent. How did you know, he said, from across a room in under a minute? Sochi set her notes down on the floor beside her chair. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked like a woman who had rehearsed this moment and was now discovering that rehearsal is never enough. Because your father had the same symptoms, she said. His blood ran cold. My father is dead. Hyunwoo's father had died of a stroke. At least that was what the certificate said. That was what the Korean embassy in Abuja had reported. That was what his mother had been told, and what she had believed until the grief took her 4 years later, and what Hyunwoo himself had carried for 20 years like a stone sewn into the lining of his coat. My father died of a stroke, he said. Your father was poisoned, Sochi said. The same compound, the same method, introduced slowly through something he consumed daily, something so ordinary that no one thought to test for it. By the time anyone thought to look, it had already looked like natural causes. He stopped. How exactly do you know this? Because 3 weeks before he died, he came to my mother's workshop in Lagos. Sochi's voice was very controlled, the way water is controlled behind a dam. He came at night, he came alone. He told her he was frightened, that someone in his diplomatic circle had discovered what he was really doing. Not the official work. The other work. What other work? Your father was a Korean diplomat, yes, but for the last 6 years of his posting in Nigeria, he had been quietly doing something else. Building a case. She reached into the bag at her feet and produced a manila envelope, worn at the corners, the kind of envelope that has been moved from place to place for a long time. Documenting a 20-year conspiracy. State-sanctioned artifact theft, involving 3 governments, a network of private collectors, and a series of fraudulent repatriation settlements where money changed hands and objects never moved. He had names. He had transaction records. He had provenance chains showing exactly where pieces ended up and who signed the paperwork claiming they'd been returned. She held the envelope out to him. He left this with my mother. He said if anything happened to him, she should keep it safe. He said one day his son would need to know the truth. He left a photograph. She opened the envelope and placed a photograph on the bed beside him. A Korean man, mid-40s, standing outside the Nigerian National Museum in bright afternoon light. Beside him, a boy of perhaps 10 squinting against the sun holding a bottle of Fanta. Hyunwoo's hands were shaking. He said, Sochi continued, her voice finally cracking at one edge, that his son had his eyes, that you would find your way to this work eventually, that the river always returns what it takes. The river always, he couldn't finish. It's a Yoruba proverb. My mother used to say it. Your father learned it from her. Sochi looked at the photograph, then at Hyunwoo. My mother died 4 years ago. She gave me everything he left. The documents, the files, the photograph. She made me promise to find you, to give you what your father couldn't finish. Why didn't she contact me herself? Why didn't he? Because he was terrified. The people who killed him are still active, still protecting the network. And now, she said quietly, they are poisoning you, which means someone knows you've been getting close to this. Someone in your world has been watching, and someone decided it was time to make sure you don't finish what your father started. Song Yuna arrived at the clinic 4 hours after Hyunwoo was admitted. She was the kind of woman who made entrances without trying. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she moved through spaces with the absolute certainty of someone who has never had a door closed on her. 42 International Art Law, the firm that bore her name on the letterhead of half the legitimate repatriation agreements signed in the last decade. She was Hyunwoo's legal architect. She built the frameworks that made his brokerage world function. She was the most trusted person in his professional life and possibly the most trusted person in his life. Full stop. She stood in the doorway of his room and looked at him in the bed with the IV in his arm and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me you're not dying." "I'm not dying," he said. "Tell me convincingly." "I'm not dying, Yuna." She exhaled. She crossed the room and sat in the chair on the opposite side of the bed from Sochi. She looked at Sochi the way a very composed woman looks at a stranger sitting beside someone she considers hers to worry about. "Song Yuna," she said, "I'm his legal counsel, and his—" A small pause. "I've worked with him for 4 years." "Sochi Ola," Sochi said. "Artifact conservator and authenticator. I was in the building when he collapsed." "How fortunate," Yuna said pleasantly. Something in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Hyunwoo, watching them both, felt it. But he was too exhausted and too shattered by what Sochi had told him to examine, yet he introduced them properly. He gave Yuna the short version, the poisoning, the prognosis, the doctor's confirmation of heavy metal toxicity. He did not yet, mention his father. Yuna listened with the focused stillness of someone accustomed to receiving terrible information professionally. When he finished, she said, "We need to know who has access to what you eat and drink. We need to map your daily routine for the past year and identify every point of vulnerability." "I've already started," Sochi said. Yuna looked at her. "I've been making notes since the ambulance," Sochi continued evenly. "Routine, access points, dietary patterns I observed during the authentication process. I was in the building twice before today." "You've been in the building before today," Yuna repeated. "For work, the knockhead and a Benin ivory last month." Sochi held her gaze. "I'm a conservator. I observe things. It's what I do." Said Yuna. It was the most diplomatic sound Hyunwoo had ever heard carry that much suspicion. The toxicology results came back the next morning. Thallium compounds introduced chronically over an estimated 9 to 11 months. Kidney function compromised. Optic nerve inflammation. Neurological damage that was, the doctor said carefully, reversible if treatment was aggressive and immediate. Sochi had been right about everything. Hyunwoo was moved to a private recovery suite. Sochi, citing security concerns and the unique knowledge she carried about the poisoning method, refused to leave. Tae-young, his assistant, whom Hyunwoo had known for 7 years and trusted completely, installed himself outside the door. Yuna flew back to Seoul for 48 hours to manage the most pressing legal matters, promising to return. In those 48 hours, something began. Not loudly. Not the way things begin in stories where people announce their feelings to each other in well-lit rooms. It began the way rivers begin, quietly underground, finding the path of least resistance towards something inevitable. Sochi worked at the small table in the corner of his suite while he recovered. She spread photographs across the surface, artifact photographs, dozens of them, pieces she had been quietly tracking and authenticating for years. She worked with a precision that was almost meditative, cataloging, cross-referencing, her hands moving between images with the focused care of someone who understood that objects carried memory. He watched her from the bed and thought about his father standing in front of the National Museum with a 10-year-old boy, and felt something old and heavy shifting in his chest. "Tell me about them," he said one evening, meaning the photographs. She looked up. Which one? Any of them. All of them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up a photograph, a bronze figure, elongated, ceremonial, and came to sit on the edge of the chair beside his bed. This one is from Ife, she said. 13th century. It was made for a king's burial rites. The specific posture, the angle of the arms, was only used in royal funerary contexts. It means the figure is acting as a vessel, a carrier. Something that takes what the living cannot keep and holds it safely in another form. What does it hold? Grief, she said simply. It holds grief so the living don't have to carry it forever. He was quiet for a long time. My father spent 6 years trying to bring things like this home, he finally said. And I spent 15 years moving them around the world for people who have no right to own them. I told myself I was different because I didn't steal, I just facilitated. You were different, Sochi said, and you weren't. Both things can be true. She set the photograph down gently. The question is what you do with the difference now. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the directness of someone who has decided to stop being careful. You sing, he said. When you work, you probably don't know you're doing it. She blinked. I know I'm doing it. What language? Igbo. Songs my mother taught me. She used to sing while she restored things. Said the objects responded to sound, that they'd been created in ritual contexts, with music, and they recognized it. A small private smile. I know that sounds... It doesn't sound like anything except true, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly professional. Then she went back to the table and her photographs, and she sang very quietly to herself. And Choi Hyun-woo lay in his hospital bed and understood for the first time in years that he was not beyond saving. Yuna returned from Seoul on a Tuesday. She returned to find Sochi's shoes at the door of the suite, Sochi's notebook stacked beside the window, Sochi's voice coming from inside the room, low, unhurried, and Hyun-woo's answering voice with something in it that Yuna had never heard before, a quality she couldn't name immediately. She stood in the corridor for a moment before she went in. She named it later in the privacy of her own head, at 2 a.m. in her hotel room. She named it softness. She had known Choi Hyun-woo for 4 years. She had seen him in courtrooms and boardrooms and crisis negotiations. She had seen him exhausted, frustrated, occasionally furious. She had never seen him soft. She hadn't known he was capable of it. And it disturbed her in a way she was not prepared for, because she had a very precise internal architecture and this particular disturbance didn't have a room in it. She told herself it was professional concern. Sochi was a stranger who had inserted herself into a vulnerable situation. Her credentials checked out. Impeccably, actually, which was almost more irritating. But her motives remained opaque. Hyun-woo was compromised, physically and emotionally. Someone needed to maintain clear-eyed objectivity. Yuna would maintain it. The next morning, she called a colleague at the International Council of Museums and asked some careful questions about a Benin ivory authentication completed 8 months ago. The colleague, puzzled, said the authentication had been sound, but that there was some ambiguity in the provenance documentation. Nothing conclusive, nothing that had been raised at the time, but... Could it be raised now? Yuna asked. A pause. I suppose someone could ask questions. Someone should, Yuna said. Professionally, carefully. I'm not saying there was error. I'm saying due diligence. She hung up and looked at herself in the hotel mirror for a long time. She did not examine what she had just done. She filed it under professional caution and moved on. On the 4th day, Sochi showed him everything. She had been building toward it, he understood in retrospect. Laying groundwork, letting him recover enough to receive it. She spread the full documentation across the table in his suite. His father's original files cross-referenced with her own decade of research. A map of 47 objects that existed in the paper trail as repatriated, returned, restored to origin, and existed in reality in a private vault in Basel, Switzerland, catalogued as uncatalogued holdings, provenance uncertain. 47 pieces, she said. Your father documented everyone. Transaction records, forged certificates of return, the names of the officials who signed them in exchange for settlement money that was never passed on to the originating institutions. She laid a page in front of him, a list of names. 3 of these people are still active, still in positions where they can protect this. Hyunwoo looked at the list, then at the vault inventory photographs, then at the objects themselves. Photographs she had taken on a research visit to Basel 2 years ago, pretending to be studying comparative metalwork. 47 objects, bronzes, terracottas, ceremonial ivory, textile fragments, each one with a story she could tell, each one with a community it came from. He almost did it, Hyunwoo said. He did do it, Sochi said. He just never got to deliver it. He built the entire case. He had contacts in 3 governments ready to act on it. He had a journalist at a major international paper who was going to run the story simultaneously with the official disclosure. Her voice was steady, but her hands, he noticed, were pressing flat against the table. He was 3 weeks from delivering everything when he died, when he was killed. Hyunwoo was quiet for a long time. The people who killed him, he said. They're the same people who are poisoning me. Someone in your network has been feeding information to them for months. Someone who knows your movements, your access, your daily routine. She met his eyes. Someone who has watched you get close to this work. Your brokerage has put you in rooms with 3 of the names on that list in the last 2 years, and decided you were too dangerous to leave alive. He looked at the 47 photographs. He thought about his father, standing outside the National Museum in Lagos sunlight, believing in something enough to die for it. He felt something move through him. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Something larger, something that felt like a door opening onto a room he hadn't known existed in himself. What do we need to do? He said, to finish it. Sochi looked at him. Are you sure? He was 3 weeks away. I have everything he built and everything I've built on top of it without knowing it. He looked up. I'm sure. She nodded slowly. Then she said, we need proof of who's been poisoning you. We need the Basel vault exposed, and we need to do both at the same time. Because if one happens without the other, the people on this list disappear and take the objects with them. Then we do both at the same time. It's dangerous. My father thought it was worth it. Your father died. My father died because he was alone. Hyunwoo looked at her steadily. I'm not alone. Something passed across Sochi's face, complicated and unguarded there and then carefully put away. No, she said quietly. You're not. The authentication query reached Sochi's phone on a Thursday morning while she was in the hotel gym at 5:30. She read it and went still. It was from a contact at the ICOM. Professional, courteous, the kind of message that was almost impossible to object to on its face. Questions had been raised about her Benin Ivory authentication from 8 months ago. Could she provide supplementary documentation? The matter was being reviewed. She stood in the empty gym and read the message 3 times. Then she went upstairs and knocked on Hyunwoo's suite door. He was awake. He was always awake early, she had noticed, as though sleep were something he was still learning to trust. She showed him the message without comment. He read it. This authentication was solid. The authentication was flawless, she said. I have 4 years of documentation on that piece. There is no legitimate ambiguity. Then someone created the appearance of ambiguity. Someone with institutional access and professional credibility, she said. Someone who knows exactly which questions to ask to make a conservator look careless. She paused. Someone who wants me discredited and removed from this situation. She didn't say Yuna's name. She didn't have to. Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me handle it." "Hyunwoo, let me handle it," he said again with the particular calm that she was learning meant something had been decided. "You focus on the Basel documentation. I'll find out where the query originated." He found out by the end of the day. He sat with the information for a long time without saying anything to either woman. He was still sitting with it when his assistant Tae-young knocked and entered. Tae-young, 7 years. The person who knew his schedule better than anyone, who ordered his coffee, managed his supplements, coordinated every detail of his daily routine. Hyunwoo looked at him. Tae-young looked back, and something in his expression, something almost imperceptible, a microsecond of calculation, told Hyunwoo everything he needed to know. "Sit down," Hyunwoo said. Tae-young didn't sit. He stood near the door with his hands in his pockets and explained it the way a man explains a business decision, with the weary reasonableness of someone who has already moved past the moral portion of the argument. "The consortium approached me 14 months ago," he said. "They knew about your father's files. They didn't know where they were, but they knew you were moving through the right rooms, meeting the right people. They were worried you'd find them accidentally, put things together. They wanted insurance." "Insurance," Hyunwoo said. "A controlled deterioration. Something that looked like a neurological condition. Something that would slow you down, make you less effective, give them time to move the Basel holdings before you could expose them." He paused. "It was never supposed to go as far as it went. The dosage was miscalculated. I told them." "You told them," Hyunwoo said softly. Tae-young stopped talking. 7 years, Hyunwoo said. "You ordered my coffee for 7 years. You knew how I took it. You knew my supplements, my vitamins, the specific green tea I had every morning because my mother said it was good for headaches." He was very still. "Was it always the tea?" A pause. "Yes." Hyunwoo nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something he already knew becomes something he has confirmed. "How much did they pay you?" "Enough that my daughter can go to university in London without loans." "Ah," Hyunwoo said. "A reason then." "I didn't want you dead. I want you to know that. I didn't." "But you were going to let it happen." Silence. "Tae-young," Hyunwoo said, "and look at me." He looked. "I need you to understand something. The people you work for killed my father 20 years ago. They are trying to keep 47 objects stolen from communities that have been asking for them back for decades. And you who have sat in rooms with me while I have tried, imperfectly, to do something with my life that means something. You helped them." A pause. "I want you to sit with that, properly. Whatever they paid you, sit with what you helped them do." Tae-young said nothing. His hands in his pockets were very still. "Now," Hyunwoo said, "here is what is going to happen." Yuna met Tae-young for the first time at a hotel bar in Ikoyi on a Friday evening, and she told herself afterward that she hadn't sought it out, that it was circumstantial, that he had approached her, that she had simply listened. This was partially true. He had approached her, but she had stayed. He was articulate and calm, and he confirmed what she had been telling herself for weeks, that Sochi Ola was not what she appeared to be, that her sudden appearance was not coincidental, that her access to documentation about Hyunwoo's father served her own interests as much as his. He didn't pressure Yuna. He simply laid out a version of events that fit the shape of everything she already wanted to believe. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said. I thought you should know. You care about him, clearly, and someone who cares about him should be watching this situation carefully." "I am watching it carefully," Yuna said. "Good," he said. He finished his drink. "That's all I'm saying." She watched him leave and sat with her own drink for a long time. She thought about the authentication query she had initiated. She thought about the sound of Hyunwoo's voice when he spoke to Sochi, that quality she had named softness and could not unname. She thought about 4 years of working beside someone, understanding them completely in every professional dimension, and somehow never having been the person he looked at that way. She thought, if I can just remove this variable, if I can just get her out of the room, she thought, I'm protecting him. She ordered another drink and practiced believing it. The information Tae-young fed her over the next 3 weeks was curated. She understood this later. He gave her enough to keep her useful. Details about Sochi's movements, questions about her institutional affiliations, small professional ammunition, and she used some of it and sat on the rest and told herself she was being measured and responsible. Then in the 4th week, he told her about the Lagos ceremony. The plan was to return the 47 objects publicly, a formal ceremony at the National Museum, journalists, diplomatic representatives. The full weight of official accountability pressed against the people on Hyunwoo's father's list. Hyunwoo and Sochi had been building toward it for weeks. It was happening in 8 days. Tae-young said the consortium could not allow the ceremony to proceed. He said there were measures in place. He said the measures were not, his word, surgical. Yuna understood what he meant. She sat very still and understood what she had been helping with. Not Sochi's removal, not professional sabotage, not the management of a romantic inconvenience that had been dressing itself up in her mind as concern. She had been feeding information to a man who was planning to kill Choi Hyunwoo. She sat in her hotel room and did not move for a very long time. She thought about the first time she'd met him. A repatriation conference in Paris, him arguing the wrong side of a provenance dispute with complete conviction, her destroying his argument in 6 sentences, him laughing and saying, "You're right, of course, you're entirely right." Most men didn't say that. She had noted it. She had filed it in the section of herself that she never opened because nothing useful lived there. She thought about his hands, his patience, the way he called her at 11 p.m. with legal questions that weren't really legal questions, that were really him needing someone to think out loud with. She thought about the way he'd looked at Sochi in that hospital room and felt again the particular cold of something slipping irrevocably out of reach. She thought, I cannot have him. And then, with a clarity that felt like cold water, I cannot let this happen to him. She picked up her phone. She did not call Sochi. She could not make herself do that. She called a number she had memorized and never used, a number a mutual contact in international law enforcement had given her 2 years ago for a reason that had seemed theoretical at the time. She said, I have information about an imminent threat against a private individual and a conspiracy of cultural theft spanning 2 decades. I need to speak to someone tonight. Then she packed her bag. Hyunwoo had known for 5 days. He had known because Tae-young, in exchange for immunity and relocation for himself and his daughter, had told him everything. The consortium, the ceremony threat, and the channel of information that had been flowing to Tae-young from inside Hyunwoo's own legal team. He had sat with it for 5 days. He had not told Sochi. He had moved certain things, certain documents, the ceremony timeline, specific logistical details, and waited. The morning before the ceremony, he invited Taeyang to the suite. Taeyang arrived. He sat across the table from Hyunwoo and began to explain the consortium's position. A negotiated settlement. The objects could remain in Basel with official documentation adjusted. Money would flow to the originating institutions. Everyone would be satisfied. "Who are the three names?" Hyunwoo said. "Who are still active? The ones who can make this go away for you if I become a problem." Taeyang hesitated, then he gave them. He gave them because Hyunwoo had asked with such quiet authority, and because some part of Taeyang understood that the game was already over, and because there is a particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a wrong thing for a long time, and finally being given permission to set it down. "Thank you," Hyunwoo said. He looked at Sochi, who stepped out from the doorway of the adjoining room, her phone in her hand, the recording application running. Taeyang looked at the phone, then at Hyunwoo. "You planned this from the moment you woke up in that clinic," he said. "She planned it," Hyunwoo said. "I just stayed alive long enough to let her." The National Museum in Lagos on a Tuesday morning in November. 47 objects returned. Not quietly, publicly, with press, with diplomatic representatives from 3 governments who had been presented with Hyunwoo's father's documentation and given 24 hours to decide whether they wished to be on the right side of history. All 3 had chosen correctly. 2 of the names on the list had resigned their positions by Monday evening. The 3rd was under investigation. The objects were arranged in a long gallery, each on a plinth with a card bearing its origin, its approximate age, the community it came from. Scholars and community representatives had been flown in. An elderly woman from Anambra, 83 years old, walked slowly down the gallery with a staff and a granddaughter and stopped in front of a bronze vessel used in women's ceremonial rites, taken in 1969. She reached out and touched it. She said something in Igbo. Sochi, standing beside Hyunwoo, translated in a low voice. "She says her grandmother's hands are in this. She can feel them. She says, 'You have been waiting. I am sorry it took so long. Come home now.'" Hyunwoo's vision went blurry, not from the neurological damage. That was receding week by week with treatment. From something else. From the specific weight of a thing that has been wrong for a very long time becoming right finally in front of him, at the cost of everything his father had paid. He pressed his hand against his face and cried, in public, in the National Museum, in front of cameras and diplomats and journalists. He did not try to stop himself. Sochi stood beside him and said nothing and let him feel it. She understood that some things cannot be managed through. They can only be moved through. After a while, he took a long breath and lowered his hand. "He did this," he said. "He built everything that made this possible." "He did," she said. "And so did you." He looked at her. She was watching the old woman who had sat down on a bench beside the bronze vessel and was simply staying near, it her granddaughter's hand in hers. "Sochi," he said. "Don't," she said softly. "Say something important in a museum with cameras on you." He almost laughed. "Later then." "Later," she agreed. Later was the hotel rooftop at 11 p.m., Lagos spreading itself below them in its magnificent chaos, generators and traffic, and someone's Afro beats carrying up on the warm air. "Tell me what you actually thought," he said, "the first time you saw me collapse." "I thought, God, not now. Not before I've told him." "Told me what?" She turned her drink in her hands. "Your father used to talk about you. Not often. He was careful. He never said your name, never gave details that could identify you. But he talked about a boy who had his eyes in his stubbornness, who had decided at 10 years old that objects had feelings and it was wrong that anyone should own something that had a feeling." She paused. I grew up knowing you existed somewhere in the world, knowing that eventually I was supposed to find you and give you what he'd left. A pause. I didn't expect... What? She looked at him. I didn't expect to find someone I'd want to stay for after. The city moved below them. The woman, he said carefully. Yuna. Do you know? I know what she did, Sochi said. The authentication challenge. The information she was passing. A pause. I also know she made the call that gave us the final piece. The one that locked the ceremony in safely. She's gone. Yes. Do you think she... He stopped. I don't know what I want to ask. I think, Sochi said slowly, that she loved you in the way people love things they have decided they cannot have. And that decision made her do something terrible. And then that same love stopped her from letting it finish. She looked at her drink. I'm not going to tell you she was a villain. I don't think she was. I think she was a person who got lost and then found her way back just far enough to matter. He thought about Song Yuna, precise, brilliant Yuna standing in the clinic corridor before she'd come into his room. He thought about 4 years of her steadiness. He thought about the way she'd looked at Sochi and known, probably before he did, that something irreversible was happening. I hope she's all right, he said. So do I, Sochi said, and meant it. He reached across and took her hand. She looked at their hands and then at him. I want to stay, he said, in Lagos or wherever the work takes you. I want to be where you are. I want to learn what you know about these objects, about these communities, about the stories underneath the stories. He paused. I want to finish what my father started, but not as a broker, as someone who gives things back and asks for nothing. That's not a very lucrative business model. I have savings. You have considerable savings, she acknowledged. Sochi. I know what you're saying. Then say yes. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had been carrying toward for 3 years across 2 continents, through grief and waiting and one very difficult month. This man who had cried in a museum and meant it. Who asked the right questions. Who had inherited his father's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and was trying with both to be something better than what the world had made of him. Yes, she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and it was not dramatic. It was just real, the way the best things are. 6 months later, Choi Hyun-woo enrolled in a postgraduate program in cultural heritage law at the University of Lagos. His vision had recovered to 90%. The neurologist said the remaining 10% might return with time, or might not. Hyun-woo had decided not to spend his life waiting to find out. Sochi Ola opened a small restoration workshop in a converted building in Yaba. 3 rooms, good light, a table long, enough for the largest pieces, and a shelf above the door where she kept a photograph of her mother, and beside it, a photograph of a Korean man standing outside the National Museum in 1999 sunlight. Hyun-woo had an office desk in the corner of the workshop. He did his coursework there in the mornings. In the afternoons, he assisted Sochi, learning to identify pieces, to understand provenance, to hear the stories she heard when she looked at something old and held with care. He was, she told him, a slow learner with excellent instincts. He told her he was choosing to take that as a compliment. On a Saturday in April, 3 months after they moved into the Yaba workshop together, Sochi came home from a site visit to find the table cleared of everything except a small object wrapped in cloth and a note. The object was an Igbo Ikenga figure. Small, old, legally acquired by his father at a market in Enugu in 1997. He had found it in a storage unit in Seoul along with his father's other effects. He had been carrying it for months, not knowing what to do with it. The note said, I have been watching you restore things for months. I have been watching you give things back to the places they belong. I think you should know that I have found the place I belong. I would like, if you'll let me, to stay there. Formally, officially, irrevocably. She read the note twice. She unwrapped the figure. It was beautiful, worn smooth with age, the posture of absolute stillness that the best ritual objects carry. She looked up. Hyunwoo was standing in the doorway of the workshop with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who has constructed an entire speech and abandoned it. I don't have a ring, he said. I thought the figure was more. It's more, she said. It's exactly more. Is that a yes? It's a yes, she said, and come here. They were married in Lagos on a Friday in July in the garden of a house in Lekki that belonged to Sochi's aunt, under a canopy of white and gold fabric that moved in the sea breeze coming off the Atlantic. The ceremony braided traditions with the same care Sochi brought to restoration work. Igbo wine carrying, Korean paebek bowing to honor ancestors, a Christian blessing and a passage from the Tao Te Ching that Hyunwoo's mother had kept pinned above her desk for 30 years. It was not a perfect blending. Some parts fit awkwardly, needed adjustment, required both families to lean into discomfort and find the beauty on the other side. It was, in this way, exactly right. Hyunwoo wore a deep indigo hanbok. Sochi wore an Isiagu blouse and wrapper in bronze and cream. When it came time for vows, Hyunwoo spoke first. My father believed that the river always returns what it takes, he said. I spent 20 years not understanding what he meant. I understand now. The river took him too soon, and it took years I should have had knowing the truth. And it took objects from communities that deserved to keep them. But it also returned. It returned a woman who carried his work when no one else would. It returned me to the purpose I had at 10 years old, before I learned to be practical about it. It returned the possibility of something real. He looked at her. I promised to spend the rest of my life returning things to their origins, to their people, to the places they belong. Starting with myself. I belong with you. That is not going to change. Sochi's vows were shorter. She had written them at the workshop table at 5 in the morning and crossed out everything that sounded like a speech. Your father asked my mother to protect what he'd built, she said. My mother asked me to find you. I found you. But no one asked me to fall in love with you. That was entirely your fault, and I am not complaining. She paused. I promise to tell you the truth about objects and about yourself and about what you are capable of, which is more than you think. I promise to be someone you can think out loud with. I promise that whatever the river takes from us, we look for it together. The sea breeze moved through the gold fabric above them. Someone in the back, Sochi's aunt, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob and was exactly the sound a room makes when it recognizes the real thing. Somewhere, in a hotel in a city that doesn't need to be named, Song Yuna sat in a chair by a window with a glass of wine and a brief filed to the international court that bore her name and would, when accepted, formally begin the process of investigating 2 decades of fraudulent repatriation settlements. She had filed it anonymously. Then she had attached her name. If she was going to be responsible for damage, she would be responsible for repair. She did not watch the wedding. She didn't know it was happening, and if she had known, she would not have watched. Some distances are chosen, and choosing them is a form of grace. She looked at the brief. She thought about a man who had once said entirely right. You're entirely right, and meant it. She thought about what it meant to love something correctly when you had already loved it wrong. She thought, he is safe. He is where he belongs. She thought, that will have to be enough. She took a sip of her wine and went back to work. The workshop in Yaba was always warm. Good light in the mornings, the smell of restoration materials and strong coffee. The sound of Lagos outside, and sometimes very quietly, The sound of Sochi singing in Igbo while her hands moved over something old and broken and worth keeping. Hyunwoo sat at his desk in the corner and studied and watched her and thought, not for the last time, about rivers, about what they take and what they return, and how long they are willing to wait. About a man standing in Lagos sunlight in 1999 with his son beside him, believing in something enough to give his life for it. About objects that have been waiting in the dark for 50 years, feeling the hands of the people who made them every time someone touches them with care. About a woman who had carried a dead man's work for a decade and delivered it exactly where it needed to go. He looked up from his books. She looked up from the piece she was working on. They looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have stopped needing words for everything. The sea breeze came in through the open window. Lagos carried on. And in the workshop in Yaba, in the good light, something that had been waiting for 20 years settled quietly, finally into place. If this story moved you, if Sochi and Hyunwoo's journey hit something real, please like this video and subscribe to Soul Heart Stories. Every subscribe tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling matters. Drop in the comments. Whose arc hit you hardest? Hyunwoo finding his father's truth? Sochi finally delivering what she'd carried for years? Or Yuna choosing grace over destruction? I'll read every single one. The river always returns what it takes.